Thank you. I'd like to especially thank Andy Shalal and Busboys and Poets for providing such an amazing venue. And the most amazing array of books I've seen in a very long time. I want to especially thank Andy also for participating in the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee's Stop campaign and our Interfaith Coalition's formal mock trial on Sunday. We did get relatively rowdy, I would say, but it was a great trial. It was non-fictional in that, although we of course had to use actors for certain roles, it was based on real United States laws, real UN and international treaty standards. The information we presented was in fact taken from credible sources, either US government documents, Washington Post articles, New York Times, direct detainee statements, et cetera, et cetera. We also brought in living torture survivors from Latin America who had had exactly the same practices used on them and often had a North American in their cell, and finished up with a statement from a military expert that we need not be doing this. Torture doesn't work as an intelligence tool, and in fact it endangers us instead of increasing our national security. So thank you very much, Andy. He played a really remarkable role, and we're very grateful. The reason I wrote this book is because I wanted to put together all of the information I've been amassing over the last many years about US-sponsored torture. And ironically, I had almost finished this book when the Abu Ghraib photographs, in fact, aired on 60 Minutes, which of course made me have to go back to the drawing board and rewrite it. But I was happy to rewrite it given the incredible moral crisis that I think our country is facing now. Certainly, torture has been declared abhorrent to all of our national values since the framing of the Constitution. When the question came up with our Congress very early on after the American Revolution as to whether or not torture should be permitted here in special instances of national security, Patrick Henry pointed out that the rack, the screw, and the star chamber were left behind in the old world for very good reason, and that if we allow those practices here, we are, quote, lost and undone. Needless to say, we have very often failed to live up to our national values, slavery being a very obvious example, the internment of the Japanese, police brutality cases, condoning of lynchings, the Trail of Tears for Native Americans, right up through today with the case of Abner Louima, certainly Rodney King, prison conditions, and so on and so forth. But what I'd really like to talk about tonight is not only what's happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo, but how far back that practice goes, what the legal consequences of that fact is, and what we need to do about it. And that is what the book is about. I've compiled all of the cases that I've encountered during my investigations in Latin America during the last decade. I've also done a legal analysis and also interviewed many security experts. So that is the content of the book. I think most of you know part of my personal history. My husband was a Mayan resistance leader in Guatemala in the 1990s. He was captured alive by the Guatemalan military, who declared that he had been killed in combat. That was false. They had in fact taken him as a prisoner, held him in secret detention, and decided to subject him to long-term torture in order to break him psychologically. They didn't want anyone interfering on the basis of human rights, so they killed an 18-year-old soldier whom they literally dragged out of the base the same night, battered to death so that he was unrecognizable, placed him in an olive green uniform, and put him in a grave. When we asked what the description of the body was, we were sent my husband's description instead of the 18-year-old's. I much later found out that, in fact, Everardo was alive being tortured, opened the grave, and began a series of hunger strikes to save his life. Throughout the entire 2 years I was trying to find him, he was in fact alive for most of that. But it was only after my third hunger strike in the spring of 1995 that we were able to get information from a very furious Congressman Torricelli, who was on the House Intelligence Committee. And they were able to confirm that Everardo had, in fact, been tortured for a very long time period. He had, in fact, been killed upon orders of Colonel Julio Roberto Alpérez, who was also working for the CIA as a paid informant or asset. We also learned that the same month that Alpérez was witnessed bending over the torture table with my husband's body so grotesquely swollen that one arm and leg had apparently hemorrhaged, that Alpidez received $44,000 from the CIA that same month. We also learned that several of the people in military intelligence were in fact paid CIA assets that were handling my husband's case. Many of them were also on the corrupt officer list of the DEA, and between 8 and 12 were trained at the School of the Americas. All roads in the end do lead to Rome. During that time period, I became fast friends with Sister Diana Ortiz, who of course was very seriously tortured in Guatemala and had a North American come into her cell and demand that she be released to him. He knew where she would be, he knew what her name was, he knew on a first-name basis who the torturers were, and had the authority to demand that she be released because she was an American citizen. He spoke heavily accented Spanish with a very heavy American accent and looked not at all Guatemalan, and understood her perfectly when she addressed him in English and eventually responded to her in English. When she later asked that the U.S. Embassy send this man back to release the other people or rescue the other people in that clandestine center, that torture center, a smear campaign was started by the United States government to the effect that she was perhaps mentally unstable, didn't know what had happened. Rumors began to circulate about self-inflicted injuries such as the 111 cigarette burns on her back, and so on and so forth. It was very clear to all of us who knew Sister Diana, who now runs, of course, the Torture, Abolition, and Survivor Support Coalition, that she knew exactly what had happened to her. So I began investigating more and more cases of U.S. sponsorship of torture, whether direct or by proxy. I was just very curious because certainly it was unlawful to heavily fund and also train well-known human rights violators across Latin America. Under our different statutes for the appropriations bill, it was illegal to fund known and systematic human rights violators. But what the CIA and the State Department had always vehemently insisted was that there was no direct participation in the death squad torture. Maybe they weren't really members of the military anyway, maybe they were private operators. And in any event, the CIA and the School of the Americas were just trying to professionalize people and make the situation better and knew nothing about individual cases. As it turned out in my husband's case, the CIA and the State Department knew where he was and that he was still alive during the 2 years that I was trying to find him. By the time the truth came out, he had either been thrown from a helicopter or dismembered. He had also spent a very long period of time in a full body cast because he had tried so many times to escape. The decision to kill him came only after they insisted that he lead them to a clandestine radio station, and he led them instead into an ambush. I think it's important to take note, the two cases, Sister Diana tried to say anything they told her to say so that they would stop burning her and attacking her with ferocious dogs. My husband said nothing at all in 2 years. The use of torture, as any intelligence official will tell you, does not give you good intelligence. It either gives you nothing because people know they're going to die anyway, or it gives you Niagara Falls, every name in the phone book. It does not give you good intelligence. Our government now, with the photographs at Abu Ghraib and the ongoing and relentless stream of disclosures, witness statements, forensic reports, et cetera, has offered us 3 statements. They say that number 1, there's not really a pattern and practice or any kind of policy of torture, which really at this stage of the game is ridiculous on its face. But nevertheless, only those few soldiers that have been directly caught on film or in other unassailable portions of evidence have been brought to court-martial and sent to prison. And what our high-level officials keep saying is it's not a policy, it's just a few soldiers out of control, it's excessive force here and there, and those people have been brought to trial and put in prison, so this is the American way, don't worry about it, it's being taken care of. Why do they keep insisting that in the face of this flood of evidence that it is indeed policy? Because if it's policy, if it was authorized at the very top, then under the laws of command responsibility, people like Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Tennant must stand trial for criminal charges as well. There are 2 felony statutes in this country which give you a 20-year sentence for ordering or conspiring to order or to carry out the torture of a detainee abroad. It's a felony. If the person dies, it can carry the death penalty as well. We keep hearing, first, that it's not a policy, second, that it's not illegal, that what's being done in the case of the detainees, because they're terrorists and enemy combatants, somehow they fall between the laws and treaties that prohibit torture, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And thirdly, they keep telling us that, well, even if it's illegal, which it's not, put that aside for the moment, you have to let us do it or you will be the next ones to die in a terrorist attack. You have to let us keep you safe.